Suspend yourself 37,000 feet above the Earth on a brilliant, cloudless summer afternoon. It is July 19th, 1989. United Airlines Flight 232, a massive McDonnell Douglas DC-10, is flying a completely routine route from Denver to Chicago. Inside the wide, spacious cabin, the atmosphere is perfectly tranquil. 285 passengers and 11 crew members are settled in for the journey. Business travelers are reviewing paperwork, parents are adjusting the air conditioning vents, and children are slowly drifting to sleep against the hum of the three massive jet engines. Looking out the thick acrylic windows at the sprawling geometric farmlands of the American Midwest below, everything feels solid. Everything feels guaranteed. The sheer miracle of human flight has been reduced to a comfortable, entirely predictable routine. But the harsh reality of commercial aviation is that perfect safety is an illusion, balanced entirely on the incredibly tight tolerances of mechanical engineering. And deeply hidden inside the tail-mounted number 2 engine of this perfectly functioning aircraft, a microscopic, completely invisible flaw in the titanium metallurgy that had been growing silently for nearly 2 decades is about to violently break that illusion. To understand the terror of what is about to happen, you must first understand how a modern commercial airliner actually flies. An airplane weighing nearly 300,000 pounds is not flown by the physical strength of a human being. It is flown by high-pressure fluid. The pilot simply turns a control yoke or pushes a pedal, and a complex network of hydraulic fluid instantly rushes through braided metal lines, acting as the heavy, unstoppable muscle that physically pushes the massive ailerons on the wings and the heavy elevators on the tail against the brutal, crushing force of the slipstream. Because hydraulic power is the absolute lifeblood of the aircraft, the brilliant engineers who designed the DC-10 built it with 3 completely separate, independent hydraulic systems. The logical foundation of this design is mathematical redundancy. If System 1 suffers a leak, System 2 takes over. If System 2 fails, System 3 is there. The mathematical probability of all 3 independent systems failing simultaneously during a single flight was calculated by aeronautical engineers to be exactly 1 in a billion. It was a statistical impossibility. The manufacturer did not even write a checklist for it because they firmly believed it could never happen. But physics does not care about statistics. Without a single warning light, without any subtle change in vibration, the massive rotating titanium fan disc inside the tail engine suddenly violently shattered. This is an event classified in aviation as an uncontained engine failure. Heavy, razor-sharp pieces of titanium shrapnel blasted outward at supersonic speeds, carrying the destructive kinetic energy of an artillery shell. The metal ripped through the rear fuselage of the aircraft with devastating precision. And by a twist of impossibly cruel fate, that flying shrapnel severed the highly pressurized lines for hydraulic System 1. It sliced directly through the lines for System 2, and it completely destroyed System 3. In a matter of agonizingly short seconds, all of the vital fluid that gave the pilots control of the aircraft bled completely out into the freezing high-altitude atmosphere. Inside the flight deck, the transition from routine boredom to absolute survival was instantaneous. A deafening explosion shook the entire airframe. The master warning lights illuminated the dark panels in a bright, terrifying crimson glow. Captain Al Haynes, an incredibly seasoned veteran of the skies, reacted with pure instinct. He grabbed his control column to stabilize the shaking aircraft, but his hands met something terrifying. The control yoke was completely slack. It moved freely in his hands without any resistance. Beside him, First Officer William Records pulled his own control column back as far as it would go. Nothing happened. The flight engineer, Dudley Dvorak, desperately scanned his digital panels, watching the hydraulic pressure gauges drop rapidly to absolute zero. The harsh, undeniable reality suddenly descended upon the cockpit. They were flying nearly 6 miles above the Earth at over 500 miles per hour, and they were sitting in a 300,000-pound deadweight. They had completely lost all aerodynamic flight controls. They could not turn the plane. They could not raise the nose. They could not lower the nose. And the massive aircraft was already beginning to enter a steep, terrifying, uncommanded bank to the right, beginning a slow descent toward the ground. In the history of commercial aviation, this was a death sentence. There were no procedures for this. There were no manuals. But survival in the air relies on a distinctly human trait that no computer can replicate: imagination. Captain Haynes and his crew realized that while the tail engine was destroyed and the wings were essentially paralyzed metal, the two massive high bypass jet engines mounted beneath the left and right wings were still functioning perfectly. They quickly theorized that by manually manipulating the thrust of these two remaining engines, they might be able to steer the aircraft using nothing but raw propulsion. If they pushed the left throttle forward, increasing thrust on the left side, it might force the right wing up and turn the plane to the left. If they pulled the right throttle back, it would compound the effect. And if they shoved both throttles forward, the massive surge of speed would generate just enough lift under the wings to force the nose up. It was a brilliant, deeply desperate hypothesis. They were trying to steer a colossal, fast-moving machine with the equivalent of the gas pedal alone. It was right at this terrifying moment that a miraculous twist of fate occurred. Back in the passenger cabin, sitting completely anonymously in a first-class seat, was Dennis Fitch. He was not just a passenger. He was an off-duty United Airlines flight instructor and a highly respected check airman for the DC-10. Realizing that the aircraft was deeply unstable, he offered his assistance to the cabin crew, who brought him forward to the flight deck. Fitch stepped into the cramped, incredibly tense cockpit and immediately saw the unimaginable severity of the crisis. He knelt on the floor, directly between the captain and the first officer, reached up with his bare hands, and took physical control of the two wing engine throttle levers. For the next 45 agonizing minutes, Fitch would literally fly the dying airliner with his fingertips, pushing and pulling the heavy levers, making microscopic adjustments to the engine roar to keep the massive wings from rolling over into a death spiral. Haynes and Records maintained a death grip on the useless control yokes, not because they did anything, but because the sheer physical effort of throwing their body weight into the controls gave them a psychological sense of resistance. The atmosphere in that cockpit was a masterclass in modern human survival psychology. Despite staring directly into the abyss of certain death, the cockpit voice recorder did not capture the sound of blind, screaming panic. Instead, it captured absolute professionalism. It captured men cooperating with total focus. There were no egos. Nobody pulled rank. They shared every piece of information. They coordinated their actions flawlessly with the air traffic controller on the ground. And remarkably, they even found brief moments of dark humor to cut the suffocating tension. The captain famously radioed approach control with a slight, ironic chuckle, saying, "Whatever you do, keep us away from the city." At one point, when air traffic control cleared them to land on any runway, the captain responded, "You want to be particular and make it a runway, huh?" They were utilizing supreme intellectual control to override their primitive fear. The approach into Sioux City, Iowa, was harrowing beyond description. The aircraft was trapped in what is known as a phugoid cycle, a terrifying aerodynamic wave where the plane pitches up, loses speed, drops its nose, gains speed, and pitches back up again. By manipulating the thrust, Fitch was managing to keep the oscillations somewhat under control, but it was incredibly imprecise. Because they had no flaps and no leading-edge slats to slow the airplane down, they were screaming toward the earth at a terrifyingly high rate of speed. A normal landing approach speed for a DC-10 is around 140 knots. United 232 was descending toward the concrete at over 215 knots, with a descent rate completely exceeding structural limitations. Through the windshield, the flat green geometry of the Iowa cornfields was rushing up to meet them with terrifying speed. As they dropped below 100 feet, the absolute unforgiving nature of fluid dynamics finally caught up with them. A sudden thermal updraft, a massive invisible bubble of rising hot summer air, caught the right wing. Because they had no ailerons to fight it, the right wing dipped violently toward the ground. The nose pitched down sharply. Fitch violently slammed the right throttle all the way to the firewall, desperately trying to generate enough lift to push the dropping wing back up. But thrust takes time to spool. Jet engines require critical seconds to suck in the dense air and compress it into explosive power. They simply ran out of time. They ran out of altitude, and they ran out of sky. The right wingtip completely smashed into the concrete runway with unimaginable violence. Instantly, thousands of gallons of highly volatile jet fuel housed inside the wing structures exploded into an enormous, rolling fireball that dwarfed the size of the aircraft itself. The massive tail section snapped off entirely. The right engine was violently ripped from its mounting pylons. The main fuselage, tearing itself into thousands of jagged pieces of aluminum, careened down the runway at tremendous speed, tumbling end over end. Thick black dirt, blinding smoke, and daylight rushed violently into the passenger cabin. And then, as the twisted remnants of the heavy machine finally skidded to a halt upside down in an adjacent cornfield, the deafening, tearing sound of the crash was replaced by a deeply chilling, unnatural silence. What followed is the true legacy of this incredible flight. As the flames burned and the emergency response vehicles rushed toward the broken metal, people began to walk out of the cornfield. First a few, then dozens. Out of the 296 human souls on board that mathematically doomed aircraft, an astonishing 184 people survived the impact. The survival rate defied all logic. It defied the violent kinetic energy of the crash. It was due in part to the incredibly robust engineering of the DC-10 airframe, which acted as a massive protective cage, and the immediate, overwhelming response of the Sioux City emergency teams, who were coincidentally undergoing a massive shift change, doubling the number of medical personnel available. But the most fundamental reason anyone survived that day sits entirely with the 4 men trapped in the flight deck. By refusing to give up when the manual ran out of pages, by inventing a radical new way to fly an airliner on the spot, they delivered their passengers to a runway instead of allowing the aircraft to plunge uncontrollably from cruising altitude. The crash of United Flight 232 completely altered the trajectory of modern commercial aviation safety. The investigation determined that a microscopic manufacturing defect, combined with insufficient metallurgical testing techniques, led directly to the explosion of the titanium disc. Engineering solutions were immediately implemented across the globe. Airframe manufacturers began installing highly sensitive hydraulic fuses, effectively mechanical shut-off valves, in the tail sections of aircraft. If a system is suddenly severed by flying debris, these fuses instantly lock down, isolating the damaged section and trapping enough hydraulic fluid in the forward systems to allow pilots to maintain control of the wings. The mathematical theory of absolute redundancy had been proven wrong by harsh physical reality, and the industry aggressively corrected it. Furthermore, the psychological environment inside that flight deck became the global gold standard for airline crew training. It proved that in the face of catastrophic odds, the concept of crew resource management, the idea that every voice in the cockpit has absolute value and must work in perfect collaborative harmony, is a tool far more powerful than any computer algorithm. Modern pilots now sit in highly advanced hydraulic motion simulators across the world and actively practice the impossible. They practice flying heavy jets without a drop of hydraulic fluid, relying entirely on the uneven roar of engine thrust, purely because of the legacy created above those cornfields. When we consider the miraculous reality of modern flight, it is easy to assume that our absolute safety is guaranteed purely by the thousands of microchips, sensors, and structural titanium surrounding us. But aviation relies entirely on millions of microscopic, invisible human decisions. The mechanics who meticulously inspect the fan blades, the dispatchers calculating heavy wind factors, the air traffic controllers organizing a vast, silent ocean of metal, and the pilots who stand at the final barrier between physics and disaster. In our everyday lives, we are taught to strictly follow the rules, to adhere perfectly to the standard operating procedures. But this defining moment in human history teaches us a far more profound philosophical lesson. Sometimes, salvation does not come from having the perfect plan. Sometimes, surviving the absolute darkest moment of your life depends entirely on your intellectual ability to abandon the manual, embrace your fear, and act with unyielding courage when every system around you fails. The sky remains safe not simply because we built better machines, but because we learned to trust the boundless depth of the human mind when those machines ultimately fall apart.